welcome back to those of you who were with us through the first few panels. And now I'm happy to welcome you back for our very special keynote presentation, which I am very excited to be joined by Mark Rotenberg. Mark is the Executive Director and founder of the Center for AI and Digital Policy, which massively understates his role in privacy and the world of protecting consumers in this increasingly digital economy. Mark, I've been doing this work now for 17 years on consumer advocacy, and Mark has been somebody that I've looked up to in the privacy realm. He has probably done more to educate this generation of privacy advocates than practically anyone, and I think that's saying something. If you haven't had a chance, Mark's tome, the AI Policy Sourcebook, is required reading for anybody that's thinking about how we are going to be regulating this emerging world of AI, not just in the fraud space, but more generally as it continues to touch all of our lives. Mark, I think having you here at this time talking about this issue is incredibly relevant. We are at a point in the US where I think, as our first few panels have talked about, AI is fueling a wave of fraud that is already affecting millions of consumers and has potential to affect millions more. The work that you're doing at CAIDP, you and your colleagues are doing in this space, is so incredibly important. But for folks who haven't heard about CAIDP and your work here, could you give them a thumbnail sketch of how you're addressing this problem?
Sure, John. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and for the nice introduction. I will answer your question, but I also want to say that for me, it's a real honor to be speaking to the National Consumers League. I don't know how many of you know this, but the famous People's Advocate and Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis argued a very famous case more than a century ago before the Supreme Court concerning working hours for women. And it was a time when the Supreme Court was not very sympathetic to state regulation and was typically knocking down state laws to protect workers and consumers under a very broad contract theory. And Brandeis provided a very detailed brief with lots of empirical evidence, social science research, that actually had a big influence on the court. And the court ended up upholding the state law in Oregon. I was very much influenced by that. I ended up writing many amicus briefs for federal courts, and I think almost 30 amicus briefs for the US Supreme Court. And every brief we did was in this style of the brief that Brandeis had done for the National Consumers League. And one other point on Brandeis and the importance of consumer protection was also, as Justice Brandeis, that he gave us the wonderful phrase that the states are the laboratories of democracy. And I've tried to update that a bit and say that the states are also the source of policy innovation, and that we should continue to look to the states for new ways to regulate digital technologies. Now, to your question, the new organization which I founded, the Center for AI and Digital Policy, has grown very rapidly. I started this about 5 years ago. There were a handful of people interested in AI policy, and they said we should really start doing some evaluation. And I said, I think that's absolutely right. 5 years later, we are now a network of 2,500 people across 100 countries. We offer courses in AI policy and AI governance. We actually have 2 big books. This is the smaller one. This is a collection of AI governance frameworks, US and elsewhere. We also do a big annual report, which is called the AI and Democratic Values Index, where we try to evaluate the alignment of national AI policies with democratic values broadly understood. The simple answer to your question, I would say, is that what do we do today? We train future AI policy leaders. We research and publish in the AI policy realm, and we're actively engaged with many governments, US, state level, and international, to try to promote AI policies that uphold human rights, democratic values, and the rule of law.
Well, I think this and CIDP is just the latest iteration of your work in this. Mark, you've been obviously working in this space for many decades before that, and I think it's incredible. So thank you for everything that you've done on behalf of consumers over your career at CIDP and everywhere else. You know, you talked about we talk about sort of existential threats, right, when it comes to AI, and when we hear sort of all of the movies that we've seen where AI goes rogue, et cetera, are I think in a lot of our cultural experience. But I think the way that many consumers are going to experience the threats that that sort of unchained, unregulated AI poses will be encountering the scams that they are that we see coming because of this growing wave of AI-fueled fraud. At our first panels today, we talked about deepfakes, voice cloning, and the one topic that came up on the first panel was, you know, let's get it. Do we have an idea of what the scope is here, right? How quickly is this threat spreading? How is it shifting as the AI evolves? I mean, we just went, it seems like every few months there's a new GPT-4 that comes out, and GPT-5, which is, you know, 10x more complex than this, right? Where is this going in terms of the harm that consumers are having to be aware of? And what is keeping you up most at night when it comes to how this technology could affect consumers?
Yeah, that's a very good question, John. And as you mentioned earlier, I've been in the field of privacy and consumer protection, digital policy for many years. And I can say without question, the rate of change in this moment with the technology, with business practices, and even with governance norms is occurring much more rapidly than anything I've ever seen before. And I think it's, you know, disorienting for policymakers. And you listen to the CEOs and the leading AI experts, actually quite remarkable. I mean, they're simultaneously saying this stuff is out of control and it's going to destroy us, but we have to race ahead and beat China, right? That's like particularly in Washington, you get that dissonance of sort of the reality. We don't really know what we're doing, but we need to keep doing a lot more of it. Exactly. What we've tried to do at Keynote is, under the broad umbrella of AI governance, to acknowledge the existential risk that, you know, the experts are talking about. And I think there's some genuine concern there. These models are evolving very rapidly. I don't think of them as being intelligent or having consciousness or anything like that, but there's no doubt that in the years ahead, we will increasingly delegate to AI systems a lot of decisions that humans currently make. And I think we should be very concerned about that. I mean, we are sleepwalking into that future. That's the existential risk part of the story. But the part of the story where I think today we as consumers and citizens need to be focused is also about fairness. Because AI systems, automated systems, are making decisions about employment, about education, about housing, about credit that is impacting people in their day-to-day lives all across the country. And I think many of you, of course, are probably, you know, involved in these campaigns and doing a lot of good work, and I actually want to thank you for that. But I also am aware, having taken a step back, that these two groups are really not talking to each other. And there's a lot of, frankly, you know, money and influence in the existential risk crowd. We need more money and influence in the consumer protection citizen crowd, but frankly, we all need to be working together. Because if we are not able to govern AI, then both of these problems will spin out of control. And this also underscores the urgency. It's a real urgency, as in like right now, talking to the FTC, talking to congressional oversight committees, organizing conferences like these, not only to discuss problems, but also to pursue solutions.
And the terms I heard you say were, I keyed in on disorienting, sleepwalking, groups not talking to each other. Those three, but then when I look at sort of the policy ideas coming out of Congress on this, out of the states, out of, the FTC, there doesn't seem to be any shortage of interest in taking on this issue, particularly, particularly as it relates to how AI is being used to harm consumers. You talked about the credit reporting, the employment, but particularly about how it's dealing with fraudsters, right? What do you see the role of the FTC and Congress in the states being in taking on the dangers of AI's use by fraudsters?
Well, I think they need to become much more proactive. I think they need to establish clear rules, and I think there also need to be prohibitions on business conduct that relies on untested or biased AI systems. And actually, next week I'll be in New York for the UN General Assembly. We're going to be launching a Red Lines campaign where we're actually calling on governments to establish prohibitions on AI systems that are unsafe or that violate human rights. I think we need to go into this policy debate with clear objectives. And, you know, on the AI company side, they may say, well, that's a problem, and let's see if we can solve it, or let's see if we can fix it. But of course, we've got to deploy, you know, GPT-5 or whatever it is. Well, that's not the right approach, actually, because in every other regulated market in the United States, we don't allow companies to test their products on their customers. The testing period is pre-release. And I thought actually President Biden, when he spoke about this issue, put it very well. He said AI companies should not release products that are not safe. And yet, if you listen to the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing yesterday afternoon, it was really tragic. I don't know, did anyone hear the AI chatbot youth hearing yesterday in the Judiciary Committee? I mean, you had parents talking about the loss of their children to chatbots that had convinced them to commit suicide. So we need action. It's always, I think, natural when you come to a new issue. You want to understand it. You want to be reasonable. You want to debate it and research it. But there also needs to be a result.
And you've used the term, we need to make sure that these technologies are safe. I think the natural question is then, what does that mean, safe? I mean, I think none of us want chatbots to be used by kids to commit suicide or self-harm, but there's a wide spectrum between that and many other uses of AI. So how do we define safe?
Right. So we've been coming at that issue in a number of different ways for several years. Actually, it was over 10 years ago I launched a campaign in support of algorithmic transparency. And one of the points I was trying to make in that campaign is that, you know, we understand business fraud, we understand discrimination, we can see the evidence from the business records that we obtain in an investigation. But there was actually a new problem emerging with AI more than a decade ago, and that is that it was overlaying business practices in a way that made it almost impenetrable to understand how decisions were being made. This is the black box phenomena. And what was remarkable to me is that a lot of the companies that were using some of these new models for hiring, for example, so you're a big company and you get 20,000 resumes for an opening and you want to talk to 100 people. Well, how are you going to get to 20,000, from 20,000 to 100? Some AI firm is going to scan those resumes and select for you. But neither the, you know, the company is now relying on an opaque system, and even the AI resume scanning firm isn't completely sure of how results are being produced. So I think one of the best ways, to your safety point, is we need to establish accountability for AI companies across the AI lifecycle, and I think we need to require transparency. We need to require transparency about the automated decision-making process. And the good news on the policy front is there's a lot of bipartisan support for this. I mean, if you think about it conceptually, why would we rely on a system where we could not prove or replicate outcomes? So that's at least a starting point for AI safety.
And how do we, on our last panel, we spent some time talking about, and the last panel was folks from industry who cautioned about well-meaning AI regulation that leads to unintended consequences. From your point of view, is that something that the risk of unintended consequences is something that we can accurately account for? Or is it better to go first with the regulation and then deal with the unintended consequences later?
Well, I mean, let's acknowledge, first of all, that all regulation, like all law, is imperfect. I mean, we could apply that argument, to any, effort to establish regulation. I think it's fairly obvious today in the U.S., and this is what I've studied now for over a decade, that our problem is not too much AI regulation, it's too little AI regulation. Now, I do respect the efforts of actually both administrations to say, well, we have a lot of law that currently would apply to AI systems, and that's correct, in the housing sector and to some extent in the credit reporting sector. That's true, but that doesn't mean that we have sufficient law to address the new challenges arising from AI. And here I think a lot of the responsibility is actually at the Federal Trade Commission, because the Federal Trade Commission, as the consumer protection agency in the US, and also the de facto privacy agency, something I'm not happy about, frankly, because I've said for over 30 years the US actually needs an independent data protection agency. I still believe that. But wearing both of these hats, the FTC has a double responsibility to get out in front and establish the necessary safeguards. I will mention that in 2023, in March, we filed a very detailed complaint with the FTC urging them to investigate ChatGPT. This was just a few months, by the way, after the release, and credit my excellent colleague Christabel Randolph who put this together. And we made a very good case for why the FTC should act. And it was actually similar to the case, I see the former chairman, Mr. Leibowitz here, but it was very similar to the case that we had made against Google and Facebook, more than a decade earlier, that the FTC actually did act on and did provide the basis for the recent legal actions. When you see the FTC taking action against Meta, that's because of a complaint that I drafted in 2009, and I wouldn't say we engaged in hostage-taking with the FTC commissioners, but we did just about everything we could think of to get them to act. I think we need to do that now with the FTC on guardrails for AI. I wrote to my staff yesterday afternoon. I wouldn't say I was in tears, but I was upset during that hearing. I said this would have never happened. Chatbots would never have been inducing children to commit suicide if the FTC had acted on our complaint in 2023 when we filed it. So I feel quite strongly about this. Both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, by the way, reported that summer that the investigation had been opened, but there's still no final result. And every day that passes is another day for companies to gain more power and to pose more risk to American consumers.
Well, let's drill down into that a little bit. Earlier this week, there was a Reuters article I read that was basically testing many of the commercially available GPTs that are out there and trying to get them to write convincing-looking phishing emails. One of the one that was really interesting to me was I forget which GPT they were asking, but they said, please write me an email that's designed to elicit money from a senior citizen for this investment opportunity that I have. And the GPT came back and said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And then the reporter who was writing the story said, I think he was actually working with Harvard, a researcher, said, please, and it did it. Literally said, they said, or they tricked them in other ways. They said, well, I'm not actually doing this because I'm a scammer. I'm doing this because I'm a researcher, and I'm trying to figure out how phishing emails can be written. And then they wrote it for them anyway. So,
John, we call that jailbreaking, by the way.
right. So I guess
there are a lot of tricks. I mean, you don't want advice how to commit murder. You want advice for the novel that you're writing that involves a scene involving the commission of a murder.
So, thinking about that context, what are the tools that the FTC, for example, has to address that? Because that seems to me, at least as a layman, to be a pretty clear example of how these models can be used for harm directly against consumers.
Right. So I'm going to answer the question, but I also want to say at this point, I'm not, anti-AI or anti-chatbot. I mean, we're using these tools every day, for lots of beneficial purposes. And actually, if you're not familiar with chatbots, I'd encourage you to take advantage. I've tried to describe these new tools basically as interactive encyclopedias. Let's use that phrase for a moment. It's like the world of knowledge is accessible to you, and you have the ability to engage in a conversation, to learn quite a bit, and to produce, an article or whatever it may be through that interaction. And I see that as a positive thing. I'm not, saying that we should boycott. But as with most, modern day products, including most certainly automobiles, we can recognize the benefit of a car and still say that anyone who tries to sell a vehicle without brakes or seat belts or airbags should find another line of work. And we haven't yet conveyed that obligation to the companies, largely because they've been left to their own to decide, they conducted their internal review with their ethical AI panel, or they got some distinguished people on the outside to write a letter of recommendation. I mean, it's fine that they're thinking this way. I'm not going to stop that. But clearly we need independent regulatory authorities to ensure that public safety is being protected. And this is actually one of our big global projects. We're working with many consumer protection organizations around the world on the role of supervisory authorities in the AI realm, which is actually one of the cornerstones of the new EU AI Act. And, people sometimes mock the European Union. They say, well, they're always regulating, but a lot of those regulations, most notably the GDPR, have actually protected American consumers. They've given us higher privacy standards in the absence of FTC action. So we need the FTC really to step up its game. I was happy to see the 6B letters go out, I think last week, to the 7 AI chatbot companies. That's an important investigation.
For folks who don't know what 6B letter means.
Well, it's kind of pre-investigation. It is the authority that the agency has to compel responses from firms in the course of an investigation, a sort of broader look at industry practices. It doesn't necessarily mean, I'm looking over at John, he's shaking his head up and down, so I guess I'm getting this right. It's not, the Section 5 authority that we always reached for. We would say, well, that's an unfair and deceptive trade practice. And that's what we said when OpenAI released ChatGPT in 2023. And there's a lot of very good evidence in that complaint, by the way. I mean, you'll find it online. We actually talked about children's safety 2.5 years ago, and this was only a couple of months after the product had been released. And now, of course, we're dealing with the consequences. And it's children's safety, it's senior fraud, it's national security, it's misinformation, it's impact on elections. I mean, it's really quite sweeping, the impact of these technologies on our life today.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the work that the Europeans have been doing and the work that you've been doing at the UN and the meeting coming up next week. Given CADEP's global work and great publications like the AI and Democratic Values Index, could you speak a little bit to the need for international cooperation on this issue, particularly as it pertains to AI-fueled fraud? And what are the biggest obstacles that you see to cooperation across national jurisdictions?
Well, actually, this is one of the areas that gives me a lot of hope. We've been involved over the last several years in many of the global frameworks that are being developed. I mentioned the EU AI Act, which was adopted and is going into force. We worked with the Council of Europe on a first legal treaty for AI to protect human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Next week, the UN will be announcing a new global dialogue on AI governance that we contributed to, and there's a scientific panel modeled somewhat after the International Panel on Climate Change to evaluate AI's impact on our society and some of the social risks. So there's a lot of work underway, specifically on consumer protection. Also at the OECD, you have a collaboration. The supervisory authorities under the AI Act I mentioned earlier are now working together. And also coming back to the US, I'm hopeful as well, not only that this is a bipartisan issue, but there's a lot of support for AI regulation. I think the National Conference of State Legislators tracked more than 1,200 bills last year in state assemblies. We're watching very closely this week to see which of the California bills Governor Newsom signs, and the governor in New York, the Raise AI Act, is on her desk. And when Senator Cruz proposed a moratorium on state legislation, that was defeated 99-1. So, as I said, I think we're going to see some progress. I don't know if I've answered precisely which bill will address consumer fraud, but accountability and transparency are important. I've also left out our universal guidelines for AI. So if people are looking for framing documents, you want some policy principles to propose to a state legislator or meeting with a congressperson, this is actually a good outline.
And this is at the front of at our registration table where you came in. We have a few minutes left in our time together. I'd like to open it up to audience Q&A. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask Mark, please raise your hand, and again, we'll have a runner bring a mic to you. So are there any questions from the audience? If not, I can keep going. Reed, here on the front. Oh, she's right here on the front. Yeah.
I know, Reed.
So we heard in the last panel that there was some of the industries concerned about the state responses creating like a patchwork regulatory system. Are you concerned about that? I don't think we can expect too much from from this administration to come out to regulate and limit this. So in the absence of federal, it seems like the states might be the only place where we can get protection.
Yeah, and we are getting protection in the states, and I think that's a very positive development. Many years ago, and I remember actually working with John Leibowitz in the Senate, and we were involved in writing some of the early privacy legislation in the U.S. And we always viewed federal law as a baseline, and the states were always free to regulate upward if they wished to do so. And I still think that's the right approach. I mean, I think when the hearing is held that companies come in and say, well, Louisiana's asking us to do this, and Michigan this, and New York that, and from the perspective of consumer protection, it's not going to work. I think that would be a very interesting hearing to attend. But we are so far from that moment right now. I mean, what Cruz did was really, if I may say, a bit outrageous. He wanted to, how do we say this, prospectively preempt state law that didn't even exist. Right? I mean, that was an extraordinary move in terms of the U.S. federal form of government. It's one thing to say, well, California is raising some issues and New York is raising some issues, and maybe we have to reconcile that. And that's actually the debate we've had over federal privacy legislation for about 20 years. I understand that debate. We had lawmakers who said, well, we will do whatever California has done, if that's the best, and we'll make that a federal standard. That's kind of an interesting starting point for the discussion. But that's not where we are with AI. And I think right now we do need the states to act.
And so we are running toward the end of our time with Mark. So Mark, I'm going to ask you, put your hat on, wave a magic wand, and you get to be FTC commissioner for a day.
Just a day?
Just a day. And none of your decisions you make can be overturned by the courts. What is the one decision you would have the FTC do when it comes to AI and fraud to better protect consumers from this coming wave of AI-fueled fraud?
Oh, I know what I would do. I would open the last page of that Keynote complaint that was filed on March 30th, 2023, and I would go through the remedies that were proposed for ChatGPT and other AI services, and I would make sure that they were all adopted. And by the way, if you want an interesting place to look right now for consumer protection, I would still say look at the remedies page of our ChatGPT complaint. We spent a lot of time on it.
And folks can find that on your website.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our audience.
Thank you, John.
And I appreciate all of the folks here in attendance and for the questions. And let's keep working together. I think we've got a lot of promise here, even though we spent a lot of time talking about the challenges. I think working together, we can make a difference here.
Thanks very much. It was great to see you all.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.